The New England Mafia, power built in silence. Most people hear mafia, and their mind goes straight to New York. Big headlines, big trials, big personalities. They picture suits, flash, and chaos. But the truth is, one of the most controlled and disciplined mafia territories in the country wasn't New York at all. It was New England. And the reason most people don't talk about it is the same reason it lasted as long as it did. It stayed quiet. It stayed local. It stayed sealed. Because up here, the mafia didn't need to advertise. It didn't need noise. It didn't need mythology. It needed order. It needed systems. And it needed people who understood that the real power isn't in being seen. It's in being felt. In New England, that power centered around Providence, Rhode Island, Federal Hill, Atwells Avenue, streets that to outsiders look like restaurants and old brick buildings and history tours. But for decades, those streets were something else. A headquarters, a hub, a place where decisions were made and carried out without announcements. The name that sits at the center of this era is Raymond Patriarca. Not because he was the loudest, but because he was the most effective. He didn't operate like a celebrity boss. He operated like a quiet executive. And the way he ran things made New England different from ego wars that brought heat and attention. But New England stayed organized, unified, controlled. Not perfect, not peaceful, but structured. And structure requires rules. The most important rule wasn't written down anywhere, but everyone knew it. Silence. The old code. The one outsiders call omerta. In this world, silence wasn't about pride. It wasn't a slogan. It was the foundation. It was the lock on the door that kept the whole operation protected from the outside. And for a long time, it worked. Investigators could suspect. Newspapers could hint. Locals could whisper. But proving it was another story. The machine ran because nobody spoke loud enough to stop it. That's the part people miss about the New England Mafia. It wasn't built on noise. It was built on discipline. And like every system built on silence, it only takes one crack to change everything. That crack is coming. And when it arrives, it doesn't just expose crimes, it exposes the entire structure behind them. One boss, one territory. What made New England dangerous wasn't violence. It was efficiency. While other mafia families fought over territory, New England operated under a single chain of command. One boss, one hierarchy, one center of gravity. Raymond Patriarca didn't just control Providence, he controlled the region. From Rhode Island, influence stretched north into Boston and Worcester, west toward Springfield, and down into parts of Connecticut. Crews operated locally, but authority flowed upward. Decisions didn't get made in the streets. They got approved quietly, behind closed doors, long before anyone ever saw a result. This was rare. Most mafia regions fractured under pressure. Egos clashed. Alliances shifted. Power struggles created chaos. But Patriarca understood something most bosses didn't. Control doesn't come from fear alone. It comes from predictability, from knowing the rules won't change tomorrow. Patriarca didn't need to show force often because everyone already understood the consequences. Discipline replaced spectacle. Silence replaced swagger. And that kept the tension away. His headquarters reflected that mindset. Not a nightclub, not a mansion, a vending machine business, Coinomatic, a place that blended into the neighborhood, a location that didn't invite curiosity. From that office, he summoned captains, resolved disputes, approved contracts, and issued decisions that affected thousands of lives, without ever raising his voice. Even Boston, with its independent crews and Irish gangs, had to operate carefully. Pushing too far meant disrupting a balance that Providence controlled. And once that balance was disturbed, consequences followed, not loudly, but permanently. Law enforcement struggled to map this structure because it didn't leave obvious fingerprints. Meetings were quiet. Orders were indirect. Violence, when it happened, was purposeful and rare. There were no random explosions, no unnecessary risks. The system worked because everyone played their role. But systems depend on loyalty, and loyalty depends on belief. Belief that the rules protect everyone equally. Once that belief starts to weaken, discipline turns into doubt, and doubt is where silence begins to fail. Omerta. Was the infrastructure people misunderstand Omerta because they treat it like a moral code, like it was about honor or pride or tradition. In New England, Omerta wasn't philosophical. It was practical. It was infrastructure. Silence was the load-bearing wall. Every racket depended on it. Gambling only worked if nobody talked. Loan sharking only worked if victims stayed quiet. Union control only worked if negotiations happened off the record. Even violence depended on silence, not just after it happened, but before. Planning stayed internal. Execution stayed precise. Exposure stayed minimal. This wasn't loyalty in the emotional sense. It was mutual survival. If one man talked, everyone paid. So everyone had a reason to keep their mouth shut. That understanding created a kind of discipline that outsiders couldn't penetrate. Guys didn't need to be reminded. They didn't need speeches. They knew the math. Prison sentences were expected. They were part of the deal. A stretch inside didn't make someone a victim. It made them reliable. Doing time without cooperating meant your family was looked after. It meant your name stayed clean. It meant you still belonged. That's why federal cases stalled. Investigators could wiretap, follow, observe, but they needed testimony, and testimony never came. Witnesses disappeared into silence. Suspects went to prison and said nothing. The structure held. Even rumors were managed. Loose talk got corrected early, quietly, without spectacle. The goal wasn't intimidation for the public. It was correction for the inside. Keep the system intact. But pressure builds. It always does. Mandatory minimums got longer. Life instead. Because silence only works when everyone believes it protects them. The moment someone believes the system won't hold, that the boss won't protect them, that the family won't survive, silence turns into fear. And fear doesn't stay quiet forever. Somewhere inside this machine, someone was already cracking. Not loudly, not publicly, just enough to weaken the structure. New England didn't fall apart in a single moment. It fractured slowly, invisibly, and the first fracture wasn't a bullet, it was a decision. The silence before the break. Every system gives off warnings before it fails. They're quiet, easy to miss, especially in a world built on silence. By the late 1960s, pressure was coming from every direction. Law enforcement had adapted. Federal prosecutors stopped chasing small charges and started building long-term cases. Wiretaps improved. Surveillance got smarter. Sentences got heavier. The cost of staying silent was rising. Inside the organization, the rules hadn't changed, but the world around them had. Younger guys didn't see the same guarantees the older generation believed in. Loyalty still mattered, but trust began to thin. Some men started questioning whether the structure that protected their fathers would protect them. Others felt expendable, replaceable, easy to sacrifice. And that's where silence becomes dangerous. Because Omerta only works when everyone believes the system is fair. Once that belief cracks, discipline turns into resentment. And resentment doesn't stay hidden forever. Providence still looked calm. Federal Hill still functioned. Coin-O-Matic still opened its doors. On the surface, nothing had changed. But underneath, the balance was shifting. Conversations stopped being certain. Meetings became cautious. Decisions carried hesitation. The machine was still running, but it wasn't as tight. Somewhere in this world was a man who had done what was asked of him. A man who had enforced rules, carried out orders, and accepted consequences. And that man was starting to believe the silence no longer protected him. That belief would change everything. Not all at once, not in public, but permanently. Because once one person decides the rules don't apply anymore, the entire structure becomes vulnerable. And when silence breaks, it doesn't just expose crimes, it exposes the truth behind them. Episode 1 ends here, because the next chapter isn't about power, it's about betrayal, and the name attached to it would echo through New England for decades. Joe Barboza. The first man to break the code. For decades, silence protected the New England Mafia. But silence only works as long as everyone believes in it. Joe Barboza didn't grow up dreaming of power. He wasn't a planner, a negotiator, or a diplomat. He was an enforcer. A man built for intimidation and violence in a system that relied on people like him to stay clean at the top. They called him the Animal. Barboza did the work others wouldn't. He carried out orders. He enforced discipline. He made sure problems disappeared quietly. For years, that made him valuable. And in this world, value was protection. Until the pressure changed. By the late 1960s, Barboza's usefulness started to outweigh his safety. Arrests came faster. Charges stacked higher. Promises from above felt thinner. The system that once shielded him now felt distant, calculated, and cold. This is the part most mafia stories skip. Men don't break omertà because they suddenly lose loyalty. They break it because they believe loyalty has already been broken. Barboza wasn't afraid of prison. He was afraid of being forgotten inside it. Afraid that the people he protected would survive comfortably while he carried the weight alone. Federal prosecutors understood that fear. They didn't appeal to conscience. They appealed to time. Decades instead of years. Life instead of release. Then they offered something New England had never truly faced before. A choice. Stay silent and disappear into the system. Or talk and rewrite the rules. When Joe Barboza made his decision, it wasn't emotional. It was calculated. He didn't whisper. He testified. In open court. On the record. Against men who had ruled New England quietly for years. That single act didn't just damage the organization. It exposed it. Providence felt it first. Then Boston. Then the rest of New England. Investigations gained traction. Cases that once collapsed began to stick. The illusion of untouchability shattered. But breaking the code doesn't mean escaping it. Because once silence is broken, there is no protection left. And Joe Barboza would soon learn that talking doesn't end the story. It only changes how it ends. After the silence broke, testifying was only the beginning. When Joe Barboza took the stand, the courtroom became something New England had never really seen before. An insider explaining the machine out loud. Names, roles, structure, how orders moved, how discipline was enforced, what silence had hidden for decades. For prosecutors, it was a breakthrough. For the mafia, it was an earthquake. Convictions followed, not all at once, but steadily. Cases that once stalled now had a spine. Men who believed they were insulated by silence suddenly realized that protection had limits. The structure didn't collapse overnight, but it bent in ways it never had before. Barboza was placed into witness protection. New names, new locations, new routines. On paper, he was safe. But safety in this world is relative, because the code doesn't forget. Life on the outside didn't suit him. Barboza wasn't built for anonymity. He was volatile, unstable, loud in ways that made him visible. He struggled to disappear into normal life, and that made him a liability, not just to the government, but to himself. And here's the part that complicates the story. Joe Barboza didn't stop being dangerous just because he testified. Even after cooperating, he was linked to new violence, new crimes, new problems. The same traits that made him an effective enforcer made him impossible to fully control. The government had cracked the silence, but it couldn't rewrite who Barboza was. For the mafia, the message was clear. Talking might delay consequences, but it didn't erase them. The code might be weakened. Long memory, long reach. In 1976, Joe Barboza was tracked down in San Francisco. A shotgun ambush, quick, final, brutal. The kind of ending that doesn't come with speeches or explanations. His death wasn't just revenge, it was a message. It said that silence, even when broken, still mattered. That the consequences might be delayed, years even, but they weren't erased, and that anyone considering cooperation needed to understand the cost didn't end in a courtroom. Joe Barboza changed New England forever, but he didn't escape it, and after him, the mafia had to adapt. Because once the code is broken once, it can be broken again. Episode 2 doesn't end with his death. It ends with the question his story leaves behind. If silence no longer guarantees survival, what does loyalty even mean? What Barboza unleashed. Joe Barboza didn't just testify against individuals. He changed the rules of the game. Before him, cooperation in New England was almost unthinkable. Silence wasn't just expected, it was assumed. After Barboza, that assumption was gone. Every arrest carried a new question. Will this one talk too? That uncertainty did more damage than any single conviction. Trust inside the organization weakened. Conversations became guarded. Meetings grew smaller. Information stopped flowing as freely. Men who once relied on structure began relying on instinct instead. And instinct creates mistakes. Law enforcement didn't suddenly win, but they gained leverage. They understood the psychological shift. They stopped treating silence as impenetrable and started treating it as fragile. The New England Mafia adapted, but adaptation has a cost. More insulation at the top, more distance from the bottom, less protection for the men doing the work. And that imbalance created resentment. The same resentment that pushed Barboza to speak now existed in others, even if they never followed through. Providence still held power, but it was no longer unquestioned. Boston's crews watched closely. Independent operators tested boundaries. The balanced Patriarcha built began to require constant maintenance. The era of automatic loyalty was over. From this point forward, silence became conditional. And conditional silence is dangerous. Not loudly, not public.
Anymore, because I have a purpose in life. I have only one purpose, and that is the best way I can put it is to get a peace of mind.
That peace of mind lasted about 5 years. The mob had the last word. On February 11, 1976, Barbosa was gunned down in the streets of San Francisco. Last week, 2 reputed gangsters in Boston, Gennaro Angiulo and Ilario
Joe Barbosa's betrayal didn't just damage the Boston tests the balance. Joe Barbosa damaged, and once that certainty disappeared, power had to be tested. Boston was the first place to feel it. For decades, Providence had been the center of gravity. The Patriarcha family didn't just control Rhode Island. They oversaw a regional structure that extended into Massachusetts and beyond. Boston operated within that its own traditions that didn't always align with Italian, that controlled by one organization. Crews overlapped with Irish gangs, independent leaders. Hybrid alliances moved differently that fully accepted and resisted when it didn't. What changed after Barbosa wasn't loyalty. It was confidence. Boston crews began testing boundaries. Not openly, not violently. Subtle moves to rackets that once required approval, delaying payments, negotiating harder, watching to see what would be enforced and what would be tolerated. Providence still had, but it now had to prove it. Meetings grew quieter. Decisions took longer. Orders were delivered indirectly. Trust was no longer automatic. It had to be assessed, and assessment creates hesitation. For Irish crews, this mattered. They weren't bound by omertà. They didn't share the same fear of internal discipline. What they respected wasn't tradition, it was leverage. And leverage was becoming visible. This wasn't rebellion, it was positioning. Because when a structure weakens, the first move isn't war, it's testing. And testing always comes before escalation. New England was no longer operating as a single silent machine. It was becoming a contested space, one where authority could be questioned and consequences were no longer immediate. Episode 3 isn't about a single clash or a single gang. It's about what happens when power stops being absolute. And everyone realizes the old rules may not hold. Two worlds, one city. Boston didn't just challenge Providence because of ambition. It challenged Providence because it was built differently. Italian mafia power depended on hierarchy, approval, structure, silence. Boston's Irish crews didn't operate that way. Groups like the Winter Hill Gang weren't interested in tradition or titles. They weren't raised on omertà. They didn't wait for permission unless it benefited them. Their loyalty was personal, not institutional, and that made them unpredictable. For years, coexistence worked because boundaries were understood. Italians controlled certain rackets. Irish crews controlled others. When lines blurred, Providence stepped in quietly and reset the balance. But after Barboza, that reset button didn't feel as reliable. Irish crews noticed something important. Enforcement had slowed, not disappeared, but softened. That hesitation mattered, because hesitation tells opportunists exactly how far they can push. Boston's underworld became a place where rules were negotiated instead of obeyed. Agreements became temporary. Respect became conditional. And when respect becomes conditional, it stops being protection and starts becoming leverage. Providence still expected deference. Boston began expecting concessions. This wasn't about disrespect. It was about momentum. Italian crews still had numbers, reach, and history. But Irish crews had flexibility. They adapted faster. They moved quicker. And they didn't fear internal punishment the same way mafia soldiers did. That difference created friction. Meetings grew tense. Messages got misunderstood. Silence, once calming, now felt suspicious. Every delay carried meaning. Every unanswered request felt intentional. Both sides were watching the same thing happen and interpreting it differently. Providence saw disobedience. Boston saw opportunity. And neither side believed the other would make the first violent move. That belief was the most dangerous thing of all. When balance becomes illusion, power doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes, quietly, in moments that don't look dramatic until it's too late. By the time Providence realized the balance was shifting, Boston had already adjusted to it. The testing had done its job. Lines that once felt solid now felt movable. Authority that once felt automatic now required reminders, and reminders create tension. Italian leadership still believed structure would hold, that history would correct the moment. That tradition alone carried weight. But Boston's crews weren't measuring power by tradition anymore. They were measuring it by response time, by enforcement, by consequence. And those consequences were arriving slower than before. Each delay sent a signal. Each compromise rewrote an expectation. What had once been a single regional machine was now operating as overlapping systems with different rules. Providence spoke in hierarchy. Boston responded in leverage. And neither side was fully wrong, which made conflict unavoidable. Because when two power structures operate on different logic, they can only coexist temporarily. Violence didn't start immediately. It never does. First came confrontations without blood, warnings without follow-through, moves meant to intimidate, not destroy. But intimidation only works when it's believed. Behind closed doors, confidence was fading. Not publicly, not openly, but internally. The question was no longer who controls New England. It was who's willing to prove it. That's the moment every criminal ecosystem reaches before collapse or transformation. Providence still had the crown. Boston now believed the crown could be tested, and once that belief takes hold, restraint becomes impossible. Episode 3 ends here, at the exact moment when balance stops being real and starts being remembered. Because what comes next isn't negotiation, it's violence. And the next chapter of this story isn't about silence, structure, or testing. It's about blood, alliances, and consequences that can't be undone.
Joseph Barbosa's corner in East Boston was a magnet for desperate people who needed money fast and couldn't get it elsewhere. Interest, or vigorish, was high, and the collection methods were low. But Barbosa claimed he always warned the customers first.
When we made the deal, I tell every Now the bad guys after 14 weeks that still continue to hide. You know, I stabbed them in the face, I stabbed them in the legs, I stabbed them in the arms, I stabbed them in the chest. You understand?
Barbosa and other loan sharks justify this kind of treatment on the basis of the deal.
Welcome to the channel. I hope this found you in good spirits, but if not, this topic might just help you. If not right away, you might contemplate some of the stuff you hear now, later in the near future. Today, I want to speak about one of the most powerful emotions we experience, anger. It is raw, it is consuming, and it is a force that can drive us to act in ways we never thought possible. But remember this, anger is blind. It has no vision, no plan, no strategy. It burns fiercely, but it destroys everything in its path, including you. Anger can feel empowering in the moment. It gives you adrenaline, the illusion of strength. You might think, this will help me get justice or win or prove my point. But more often than not, anger clouds your judgment. It makes you reactive instead of proactive. You lash out without thinking about the consequences. The bridges you burn in a fit of rage often take years to rebuild, if they can be rebuilt at all. Think about it. How many times have you let anger take control, only to regret your words, your actions, or your decisions later? That is because anger does not care about the aftermath. It only cares about release. But life isn't about short-term satisfaction. It is about building, growing, and achieving your goals in a way that you can be proud of. So here's the truth. Anger is an obstacle, not a tool. It blinds you to solutions, to understanding, to progress. The world does not need more blind rage. It needs vision. It needs people who can harness their emotions and turn them into strength, patience, and wisdom. The next time anger starts to rise within you, stop, breathe, remind yourself of what truly matters. Think about the bigger picture. In the moment, stepping back may feel like weakness, but it is actually the greatest strength you can show. Use your energy to build, not to destroy. Remember, the most powerful person in any situation is not the one who shouts the loudest, it is the one who thinks the clearest. Don't let anger control you. Don't let it blind you. Instead, let clarity, courage, and compassion light your path. Anger does hold some value that we should consider. While we highlight valid concerns about anger, it overlooks the fact that anger, when properly understood and directed, can be a powerful catalyst for positive change. Here is how to counteract it. First, anger is a signal. Anger isn't inherently blind. It is an emotional signal that something important to you has been violated or ignored. Instead of suppressing it, recognize it as a call to action. Ask yourself, why am I angry? This awareness transforms anger from a reactive force into a productive one. Second, channeling anger. Anger doesn't have to be destructive. It can fuel creativity, resilience, and determination. History is filled with examples of people who use their anger at injustice, inequality, or mistreatment to spark revolutions, inspire movements, and create lasting change. The key is directing it toward constructive solutions rather than destructive reactions. Third, strategic expression. Suppressing anger can be as harmful as expressing it recklessly. Instead, practice strategic expression. Take time to cool down, then communicate. Anger builds boundaries. Healthy anger allows you to establish and enforce boundaries. It is a way of saying, this is not acceptable, term resentment. Fifth, anger can illuminate values. Anger often points to your deepest values. If you are angry about injustice, it means you value fairness. If you are angry about neglect, it means you value attention and care. Use this awareness to learn to understand. Use its energy to ignite passion, its signal to clarify your values, and its presence to inspire meaningful action. Anger is empowerment and purpose.
What do I actually need?
And the relentless obsession with improvement. Do you know Jordan was cut from his high school varsity team? Most people would have quit right there, but not him. He used that moment